So thank you, Jesse, wherever you are, and Daniel. It's a great pleasure to be here. The great thing that comes with directing the cognitive science program is that students. The students do wonderful events, and then I get told, "Oh, you're doing so great." It's a terrible job. It's terrible for my ego. What I want to talk to you today is about the mystery of developmental timing. I'm a linguist, and linguists are full-blown structuralists. So we tend to think of development as, let's say, building a Lego block. How do you do a nice Lego structure? Well, you pick the right pieces and then you put them together. But in fact, language acquisition, it's more like baking a cake. You have to have the right ingredients, but you also have to put them in the right order and at the right time. Otherwise, something else shows up. So what I'm going to talk to you today is I will present a brief tutorial on what are the gross patterns of the timing of language development. Then I'm going to talk about what causes a structure in grammar to appear early or late, and I'll get more specific about how these causes have lots of problems. So I'm going to look at number agreement, construal, determiners and clitics, and noun phrase recursion before wrapping up with some general messages about how developmental research on language needs to take place. So one observation dating back to Lenenberg is that across languages and cultures, language is a robust development. It's fairly uniform in a temporal sense. Some of this is obviously attributable to maturational changes on the brain. So we see, for instance, that how the brain processes sounds changes between 6 months and 10 months of age. That's the first critical period in language development. The second critical period is showing up around the age of 5. And that's when children who learn a language before 5 process on grammaticality different from children that learn it after, even though they might become more native-like in this second language. The old-fashioned Lenenberg critical period, that it's around adolescence, that your language ability declines, and then they continue to decline through age, actually doesn't have the biological correlates. It's likely that I may relate more to changes in social cognition than changes in the language learning capacity per se. The point is, it's fairly predictable. Around 6 to 10 months, children undergo a process of perceptual tuning, when instead of being generalized listeners, they become language-specific listeners. They acquire a small comprehension vocabulary, and by the first birthday, we have first words. How do they do this? Well, we know from a lot of work that they rely extensively on statistical learning, that they use their perceptual abilities to do things like break out where the word is in the sound stream. They use their social cognitive abilities, so attending to what somebody else is attending, to also help segment the wall of sound. And they also have certain conceptual biases about what words might be. Between this, for the second and third year of life, what you have is the onset of grammar. And in English, around the age of 1.5, children start putting 2 words together, and they slowly acquire or incorporate into the speech all the little bits of grammatical morphology that make utterances complete. Their sentence length grows, and they start acquiring a richer formal repertoire. But it's incomplete. It's a work in progress. What's interesting is that although the forms of grammar are so different across the languages of the world, this is fairly robust. So Kuikuro mothers, the Kuikuro Caribe Xingu people of Mato Grosso, and they speak a Carib language. There are about 700 Kwikuru. And the mothers have a word for that moment in which, so it's a heavily inflectional language, kind of like in Inuktitut in Canada, where you put a lot of the work of syntax inside the word boundaries, and words are very long and have multiple parts. And when children start, they don't have all the parts. So their words are not plausible words in this heavily inflected language. Their mother calls these words egipanetoho, words that are made for learning, so bootstrapping words. And babies abandon these by 2 years and 4 months. And the mother would say, well, when we begin to speak with her, then she becomes a speaked person, a grammatical person. So this is across languages of the world. We see the onset of grammar. Once we move past the baby stage, then we have the idea that language helps language grow. So secondary mechanisms. One of the most important concepts is the concept of bootstrapping. The image doesn't look too good, but that is supposedly from an IKEA kitchen display. It's a blob of dough and something to cut it. And suppose you walk by this IKEA display and the person there says, hand me the FEP. You're likely going to reach for the cutter. But if you say, hand me some FEP, you're going to reach for the blob, right? So you're using the cues of, you don't know what FEP is because that word is non-existent. But you're likely using the form of the sentence to guess what I mean by FEP, okay? And children are shown to do that, and adults, we do it all the time as well. We also know that children use their abilities to extract information from social interaction, and that this shapes a lot of what these early grammars look like. Through the 4th and 7th year, we see mastery of form and onset of complexity. They get more grammatical parts. Their use of complex structures keep growing, sentence complements, relative clauses, and other modifiers. And they acquire a variety of constructions and sentence modalities. And their comprehension of grammatical markers improves. Interestingly, this is the growth part, and it looks very robust and very stable. But at the same time, within typical language development, we see a wide range of language variations. Babies that do not say the first words by the first birthday. And there are many factors that explain these individual variations. Some factors belong to the context in which the child is learning the language. We know that maternal socioeconomic status will reflect on how children perform in a language test. We know that maternal attentiveness might influence how quickly children learn words. Birth order matters. So all of these are environmental factors. We also have factors that belong to the child herself. How a baby is able to repeat nonsense words is a good predictor of how her grammar is going to look a year down the line. Speed of lexical processing. You name a word in a visual display, how quickly the baby looks at the target object is also a good indicator of when he's going to get, that he will be, how he will be performed on words 6 months later. Sociability, gender, all of these things matter. But what I'm interested, okay, and then we have bilingual development in children. So bilingualism takes place on what is a substantive reduction on language experience. Not that there is anything bad. Before you get alarmed, I think bilingualism is very, very good for children. But the fact is, you only awake a number of hours and interacting with speech with others for numbers of hours a day. A bilingual child has inherently partitioned his language. Now, there's nothing normal about monolingualism. Half of the children's world are multilingual, and it's just an Anglocentric illusion that you should speak only one language. It exists in other cultures as well. So, but what we're interested in is what happened, how can these fluctuations in timing and intensity might lead to alter the timetable of normal language development in the child? Well, for the case of Spanish in North America, Spanish is typically transmitted as a home language. We predict, and it usually either gets preserved in a weaker form by the child, or it becomes forgotten or attrited. So we predicted several patterns. You can have the child start speaking Spanish at home, and then goes on to school. And at that point, you see a slowdown in the rate of development in the home language. And that would be the extended L1. But in some children, if there is enough support in the family, in the community, the home language keeps developing. That's the timetable. So where the first line indicates the first language, and the second language, it's English, and whose exposure increases with schooling. Then we have plateaus where the child gets to a level and stay there and doesn't progress, doesn't acquire some of the aspects of the adult grammar. And then you have decrease or loss. That picture aside, we know that if the child has access to robust experience, he has a chance to learn a language, he will learn the language, and the core properties of grammars, for instance, negation, finiteness, case, will be acquired with monolingual timing and with monolingual properties. So that's was a shift in how we perceive bilingualism. In the 70s, people thought that bilingualism was bad for kids, that you were not acquiring enough because you didn't have enough of the two languages. And we've discovered that no, most of the grammar is there with monolingual timing within. Now, there's another dimension of variation. One is when a given child learns something, and then how does one structure relates to the timing of one structure relates to the timing of the other. So Brown, the founding father of developmental psycholinguistics, he says that while timing might be flexible, ordering is not. All right? So a child might acquire something by 2 or by 2 and 3 months. There's some variability, but the stages and the ordering of such stages are fairly predictable. And that's the problem that I want to address today, the relative timing of emergence and acquisition of different properties. How can we predict whether a child is going to learn a construction early or late? And easy, people will say, well, whatever is more perceptible gets acquired early. Fair enough. Whatever is more frequent gets acquired early. More transparent, if it's clear that you know what it means, then it should be acquired early. All of these things are being proposed there. If it's more robust, or if you have more complexity, then it should be later. And if you have more variability, it should be later. And then there is conceptual development, which interacts with language development in the sense that you, and Jill was going to talk a little bit about this, is that you might say, well, if you can't say something, it's maybe because you don't have the thoughts for it quite yet. But this simple view does not survive the encounter with life too long. You might say frequency. Well, if you have to learn an orange, the apple, you're going to find out really quickly that and the are much more frequent, but they don't get learned by children first. Children are more likely to learn apple and orange in some order, possibly related to the frequency, and the and a possibly related to the frequency. So you have different rules for different types of words. So not everybody's in the same comparison set. So some people have said about English verbs that the most frequent are the ones that children use. And some people have said, well, actually children select the ones with fairly stable patterns of complementation. That means if you say eat and eat the cake, that's a variable verb, as opposed to verbs where you never say an object, or verbs where you say them reliably. So it keeps getting complicated. The frequency of use also seems mediated by type of context. So recently, Nino has shown that it's not how frequent you use a verb that children are going to acquire it, but that children particularly profit from context not where the verb shows up with the object, eat the cookie, but when the verb shows up by itself with the object in the context. So here, push, that's an optimal context for learning. The tricky thing about this is for you to be able to know that the relationship between the word push and the element car is there, you have to already posit a connection between these two concepts. Okay, you have to already think that push is relational and needs something to connect to in the environment. So, so frequency is not doing as well as one might hope. Then there is a more complicated level of problem. So one thing is to say, well, I'm acquiring these words. The second thing is to say, well, I have this sentence type. What does it really mean? So I studied a few years ago the acquisition of Spanish subjunctive. And subjunctive, unlike in English, so if I were a carpenter, I'll build your house. In Spanish, subjunctive is very robust. Children acquire the forms by the age of 2 years and 3 months. So really tiny babies have this complicated morphology. But their meaning is not acquired until much later. And it comes in clumps of constructions that can be associated by meaning. Interestingly, robustness has nothing to do with it. I studied the optional pattern of subjunctive use in relative clauses. So to say something like, I'm looking for someone that will or could read me a story, except that in Spanish it's just a little vowel shift. And children at the age of 4, they already had the subjunctive, they already had the relative clause modifying construction, but they couldn't put it together. And they didn't until they learned to pass a false belief task. It's almost like until they couldn't conceptualize talking about things that are not in the real world, they couldn't incorporate this construction, which basically lets you say, I'm looking for someone, I'm not saying that person exists, but if it were to exist, I'd like to do this or that. I'd like her to read me a story. And the timing then is not a direct outcome. The timing of these subjunctive constructions has nothing to do with robustness. Relative clauses are variable. They come in right with the conceptual development of false beliefs. But you have other aspects of subjunctive, like the subjunctive that we use in factive emotive verbs. I'm happy that you are here. That are would be in subjunctive in Spanish. And that is much later, even though it's a categorical form of use. Every time you see the verb to be happy, the predicate to be happy, the following clause will have fixed subjunctive. So their robustness is not looking good. Number agreement. So this is about plurals and endings in verbs. So we know that the children are better at, and I'm talking babies, real babies, comprehending and producing plurals that are when they are in a simple syllable. So bunnies precedes pigs and precedes cops. So you have both sonority and coda complexity determining timing. Same thing for the S in third person. If you put it at the end of an utterance, children perform better detecting S's. And in Spanish, Karen Smith and her colleagues have looked at how variable realization in some varieties of Spanish, I'm a speaker of one of those varieties, really impacts. So if your language realizes the S robustly, gatos, then you are okay and you will acquire it earlier. If your language messes up with the sound, so you can say gatos, gato, gato, and you have all these multiple realizations, then children go much, much later, you know, like a couple of years difference almost. So we know that perceptual properties and variability are behave as predictive. But not always. Frequency doesn't predict sensitivity to is, are, was, where. And then you have two seemingly independent temporal timelines. And I got into this, it's Jill de Villiers' fault I got into this. So she did a study in which she shows that if you hide the S of the subject the S of the verb is not enough to disambiguate it. So this is a very simple task. Show me the picture where the cat sleeps on the bed. Okay, so the first S, if there were the cat, you wouldn't hear it because of sleep, right? So all you have is the S on the verb. And children are terrible. And what's funny about this, and I mean, it's a simple task, just point to a picture, right? We do this all the time. But if you have to rely just on that little S, you are not good at detecting it. The interesting part is that these children who are seemingly deaf to that agreement S are fantastic at saying it themselves. So these are 4- and 5-year-olds. So Jill said to me, oh, what do you think about Spanish? And I thought, oh, well, Spanish. You know, we have this really big verbal morphology. 4 out of 6 person in the paradigm are marked overtly. It's so robust, and I've never heard a kid made a mistake. So I said to Jill, no, I'm sure the Spanish kids will test this. So she said, oh, why don't you try it? So my next trip back home in the Dominican Republic, I passed the test to the kids, and they were oblivious, and they looked at me with desperation. Which one do you mean? And I was, all right, that's a mystery. So the production timeline dissociates from the comprehension timeline. Then comes French. I thought that that problem was bad enough, hard to explain. And then comes French. French has very little distinction in its noun and verb endings. Basically, it all sounds the same, right? You have this mysterious plural that might not be, you might not hear it unless the next word starts with a vowel, in which case it surfaces. So you say, les femmes, and you don't hear any S in les, the women, but if you say les hommes, you hear Z because the next word starts with vowel. So it turns out that French babies get this, and they get it, so if you give them picture choice or looking, they get it at the age of 30 months. So that's 2 years and a half. So my 5-year-old Spanish-speaking kids, these are geriatric children in the developmental field. They're struggling with this, and the French kids with this little thing that is unreliable because it only gets sounded out if the next word is a particular word that starts with a vowel. They hear ils arrivent and they know where to look. Okay? So the French liaison is a mystery. It's very low frequency. It's a tiny morphological class. But the Q reliability is high, so there is an interesting fact that the Z sound is inherently rare, so you have this distinct clump around the liaison is fairly unique. So in that sense, it's low frequency, but robust behavior, and French children go ahead of any other children. This domain is complicated in many ways. Babies look at the right picture before they can point to the right picture. Okay, so again, it almost seems like you have layers of developmental timelines. There's learning that's happening implicitly before you can actually use it or recognize it. So the overall, what we have is a lack of significant correlationships between frequency of these agreement markers and dependencies in the input. The summary is, perceptibility matters. This is a relatively simple conceptual domain. Variability matters. Frequency, not really. Robustness does, but then how do you define robustness? And variability basically has to be defined with regards to a pre-existing category. Okay. Then we have construal, the interpretations of elements in a clause. So preschool children, this is a well-known fact in developmental linguistics, that children confuse pronouns and reflexives. So if you say, you have a picture of Mama Bear and Goldilocks, and you say the bear touched her, you as an adult would interpret Mama Bear touching Goldilocks. But the kids might interpret it the same way they would interpret the bear touch herself. And reflexives are earlier, but still there's some problems early on in the 3 to 4. and they are much earlier than pronouns. And this has been studied in many, many languages, English, Dutch, Russian, and Icelandic. Interestingly, if you change the antecedent from mama bear to every bear, the performance increases. And that's in itself another structural puzzle in the field. But interestingly, across languages, there's great variation. Speaker of Romance languages like French and Spanish, la fille se lave, la lave, babies do very good at 3. In fact, this was my first experiment. I had read about this delay in the pronoun interpretation. I went and tested, and I was very chagrined because my Spanish kids did not make this cute error that the literature was reporting. So I went to my professor and said, I don't have a paper. My kids behaved well. All right. Well, it turns out that it's a great, great linguistic divide. So French and Spanish and Italian, there's no evidence of interpretation problems. But if you put it in certain constructions, such as the equivalent to the girl sees her dancing, where that hair is in that more complex construction, then the errors resurface. Prosodically, this is a mystery. English pronouns are a full syllable and with independent prosody, but the Romance pronouns are weak clitics. Okay, so prosodically, we would predict French and Spanish should be bad, English should be good. This is not the case. So, now I'm going to give you something even more. So you see all these generalizations that make so much sense, they don't take us far enough. The minute you get your hands dirty in data, it becomes clear that they're insufficient. This is an even more striking fact. We know that you interpret things that are not overtly realized. So if I say, Lola jumped over every frog and Dora did too, and I ask you, what did Dora do? What would you say? Jumped over every frog. So you are capable to pick from the context and fill in the blanks, right? No problem. Children have no problem with that either. There is a particular construction that is it's a variant of this, it's a bit more complicated. It's called antecedent-contained deletion. And it goes like this. Lola jumped over every frog that Dora did. And crucially, that doesn't mean that Dora jumped over every frog. It means that there was a set of frogs that Dora jumped, and then the other girl, Lola, or whichever one was, did those same frogs. So it's not exactly the same interpretation as before, but you could see how the surface form of both sentences are very similar. Laura jumped over every frog that Dora did. Lola jumped over every frog, and Dora did too, right? So very similar, but crucially, they will give contrasting predictions. If I have a set of frogs and Lola jumps 3 and doesn't get to the 4th, it's not true that she jumped every frog. And then suppose that the other girl comes. I think in the experiment was Miss Black and Miss Red. So Miss Black jumps over 3 and gets tired. And then Miss Red jumps and she's stronger, so she jumps over all 4. Then you would say it is true, it's false that Miss Red jumped over every frog that, no, sorry, Miss Black jumped over every frog that Miss Red did, right? But it is true that one of them jumped over every frog. So you see, so you can pin these things. If you have 2 sets of frogs, suppose now you assign the set of frogs to 2 different people. Miss Red gets these frogs and Miss Black gets this frog. And you can have a scenario in which Miss Red jumped over every frog and Miss Black did not. If you set up the scenarios that way, you basically have the opposite prediction for coordinating structures and the antecedent-contained deletion structures that have that more restricted interpretation. And what you have here, even though this is a fairly obscure construction, I bet that you've never heard of it before, probably. kids are amazingly good at construal. So here lies the mystery. Pronouns and reflexives are everyday facts of life. In fact, these are the frequencies in the brown corpora, brown legs. Every is very rare. I'm not even thinking of every in the right construction, just every is rare. And pronouns and reflexives are in the thousands, right? So kids are bad with things they hear commonly, and they are really amazingly good, like theory perfect. For a construction, they're likely to encounter very, very rarely in their experience. So what we see is uniformity at the edges of marginal frequency. To sum up on construal, we have that perceptibility is 0 here. We're talking about interpreting the invisible part of a sentence. Frequency of antecedent contained deletion is vanishingly rare, yet we see great stability in this domain. This reminds me of Chomsky's uniformity hypothesis. He says that we should predict that languages are uniform in anything that is not very overt. So in the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary, assume language to be uniform, with variety restricting to easily detectable properties of utterances. So now this is a methodological stance. So we have great diversity in languages. It's very easy to say that diversity is there, there's nothing in common. But if we take that route, then we have a hard time explaining this amazing degree of uniformity in this very scarce context. Articles and object pronouns give us another domain where we see fairly difficult to explain variations, both across languages and then in the context of bilingualism. So across languages, articles start to be used by babies at about the same time, fairly early, again, around the second birthday. But children go through stages in which they don't use them reliable. So you ask a baby, what is this? And the little one would say to you, horse, right? You've heard such exchanges. Yeah, it's very common. So we study the age in which they go from horse to a horse, right? Just when they begin to realize article more reliable. And in some languages, articles are early. Spanish, French are those languages. In English, and early in the sense of their optionality stage disappears quicker. It's not that there's no optionality stage, but it drops out fast. And then the question is, well, why do some languages, English and German, are slow to get rid of the optionality, and in other languages, babies do it quite quick? And again, many proposals. I'm going to skim quickly. Prosody is one, the type of word template that children use at the beginning of their language acquisition. There's also questions of semantic typology, nouns in the Germanic languages, in English, Swedish, can do certain things that they don't do in the Romance. There's a different relationship to determination. And what people have found is that both semantic and prosodic properties determines whether your articles are acquired early or late in the language. At the macro level, it seems that the semantic typology, what the articles mean in each language, is what matters. At the individual level, what type of words the child is able to pronounce. So if you're the kind of child that are able to pronounce longer words with certain prosodic structure, you might be the kind of child that's able to realize new articles as opposed to leaving them implicit. So we know that prosodic templates matter, but that the raw frequency across languages do not matter. In object pronouns, we see a crazy diversion. So the children, again, in the age 2, 3, you might hear them say things like that. He puts in the bathtub, so he puts the toys in the bathtub, and the content of the object is left empty. And across languages, object pronouns can be realized in 3-year-olds as little as 12% in obligatory elicited context, so this is in experimental settings, or as much as 100%, and you have the whole gamut. And it's really, really hard. Unlike the articles where you could say, well, Germanic languages behave this way. Here you have language families the same, going in different ways. You have varieties of Spanish in which 3-year-olds have 100% or close to 100% realization of pronouns. And the way we do it is you ask, what is Anna doing with the tape? She's putting it on the table. So you ask a simple question. These are very natural experiments. And yet, 2 varieties of Spanish that are very much the same, except for one little construction, seem to go in different ways. So in the variety where you have more omissions, people can say this. And this is the only difference that we have been able to detect. Shall I serve you instead of shall I serve it to you? And that's the only difference. So it's hard for me to believe that that sentence can be the source of this great variation between Colombian Spanish and Iberian Spanish. For a while, we collected the Colombian data, and the guys on the other team and ourselves, we thought like, no, they must be doing something wrong. And that's what they thought about us. And we used to think they're making the data up. No 2-year-old can have 80, 90% pronoun realization. It turns out that we did it ourselves with a new dissertation, and it's true. If you're in Madrid, your pronouns are early. If you happen to be in Medellin, your pronouns are late. How can we explain this? Well, we can use these patterns of variation to look at bilingual children. Some assumptions. We don't have a generalized delay. It's been disproven that bilingual children are simply late. If you see results like that in the media, mind a few things. Are we talking about children who's in their first language or their second language? So if you were born in a Korean household and you didn't learn English until 4, so of course things are going to be slower in English. That's no mystery. You need time to catch up. Are you talking about a child in his strong language or his weak language? Look, if my son's Spanish is very, very slow, I'm not going to judge his language abilities on the basis of a language that he doesn't speak that well, right? So we need to match bilingual children in their stronger language, and we need to consider whether we're talking about the first or the second, right? But timing also depends on structure. And researchers want to ask if there are domains that are sort of immune to being bilingualism. That was the big finding in the Paradis and Genesis study, that a dual language learner, a child that is from birth, being supported in both languages, a French-English bilingual children in a favorable bilingual environment in Canada, that those kids are going to do roughly what the monolinguals are doing. But this is for the big core properties of grammar. So what about these clitics and these object pronouns and articles, which we see are so sensitive to timing? Well, what happens is, for articles is great. If you're a German child, and German is a slow language, thank you, I'm not going to be, okay, yeah. And German is a slow language, you will have an advantage over German monolinguals, but you will have slight disadvantage over Italian bilinguals. Italian is the fast language. So in a sense, you're kind of shooting for the average. But this is not true of objects. In objects, we have never an acceleration effect. We have always a delay, no matter what. So English is fast for pronouns, and French is slow, and children are even slower in French. Toronto Francophone-speaking children have like a 30% lag with their Montrealers counterparts. Even though the parents say, oh no, we only speak French to the child, this is a monolingual child. Could it be because in English the pronouns are to the left and in French to the right? No, the same results have been recently found in bilingualism between Cape Verdean, which is a fast, robust language, and Portuguese, which is a slow and variable language. And so across the bilingual continuum, we see that children, I'm just going to refer to this graph, children, French monolingual have the less omissions. Then if you are dominant in French, you might have more omissions, and if you're balanced, you have even more. So obviously, the less French you get, the more likely you're going to keep omitting for longer. Up to a certain point, around 60%, and that stays. So if your French is very weak, you're still a 60%er. This is data from Arizona where we show that what it shows basically the timing of schooling. I just wanted to demonstrate this. So 4 articles, you see a slope, and then around 17 months, it flattens. That's the effect of the child going from spending a lot of time at home to spending a lot of time at school where the language is not Spanish. Arizona basically forbids the use of Spanish in the classrooms. Pronouns, you see a little bit of that. There's a developmental lag. The important part is that at the youngest comparison with monolinguals, monolinguals are at 85%, that's a little line over there, and you see how big the bilingual gap is. And you were interested in the top lines. The bottom lines are disordered children. The gap is much bigger with pronouns, where the English is the fast language, and this is articles where English is the slow language. So as you see, all these things interact, but not in ways we can easily accommodate it. We have a theory of why objects behave the way they do and why articles behave the way they do. It's mostly interesting to syntacticians and not to the rest of humans. So I'm going to skip, because I think I am at the edge of my time. I'm going to skip this new research that we've been doing that also presents interesting challenges, and move on to our conclusion. So we see that there are clear dimensions of timing for when children learn one aspect of grammar versus the other. Some is perceptual, that's confirmed on and on again. But it's not enough to have just a theory that says, well, very audible things will be learned earlier. We also saw that invisible things, not audible at all, show a remark robustness. We know that there is a social, cognitive, and conceptual dimension to linguistic timing. And that there is a frequency and distributional learning component to linguistic timing. How to make these things interact is less clear. Very often in explanations, we appeal to ill-defined constructs such as complexity, robustness, variability, transparency, and without those ill-defined constructs, we are unable to explain the most simple of facts about this temporal variation. The take-home message for me from all of this picture is that we cannot have one mechanism fits all grammatical learning. It just will never get off the ground with respect to developmental timing. For highly structured domains of cognition, such as language, we need explicit models of the learning problem. So we need a theory of the domain. In other words, we need a theory of language to explain language. We need, and people like me have a lot of number one. Then people more in the usage-based fields, they talk a lot about three, which is models about interaction between systems and experience, right? They neglect the first part, and that's a misfortune. And then nobody really has a good theory of what's the probably most important key in this puzzle, which is having a model of how the different domains, sound, conceptual systems, social cognition, and the different domains or parts of grammar itself, of language itself, interact with each other. And that is the integration problem, and that is the kind of problem that cognitive scientists like to solve. So here's a program. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. If you have a question, please make your way up to the front. There are microphones. While people are making their way up, I'm going to maybe lead off with a question and ask about how the different kind of embodied statuses of people would make a difference to language acquisition. So people who have deficiencies in hearing or in sight, you talked about the perceptual influence, different capacities of bodily habitus, the capacity to learn to move your limbs, and whether that might be one of the cultural differences that's relevant. Is that a kind of dimension that would help make some headway on the questions you've raised for us?
Okay, I have two parts to that question. One is anything that affects your perceptual system is going to affect the temporality of your timing. Even having lots of ear infections when you're 14-month-old might show up in your grammar by the time you're in second grade.
But if you're, say, deaf in a deaf family where it's a signing context, are all the milestones
okay,
the same?
so for deaf, deaf children in deaf homes with signing parents, they are part of that robust picture. They babble with their hands, they do their first words, they do their grammar around the age of 2, and so on and so forth. So that's completely stable. Now, if you're in a hearing environment and you get ear infections, that's going to show up, believe it or not. I mean, to me, that's amazing. Like, the kid has nothing wrong with him except not being able to hear for some months at a time. Visual impairment shows up in some aspects of language development, but again, there's a lot of that's interesting. One of Lila Gleitman, the person who proposes syntactic bootstrapping hypothesis, the idea that we learn from language itself, from inside syntax itself, did it because she was studying blind children, and she was studying how blind children learn differences, for instance, between the verb see and look, which they've done neither, but they translate it into their own haptic perception system. So the mechanisms are robust, but small alterations like bilingualism. So nowadays people are studying the case of international adoptees. So they come to North America as babies, but it's basically an abrupt language change. You're going from all Chinese, and then you get adopted in North America, and it's like there's no transition, right? So people are studying what that does to the eventual language outcomes. Second part, the embodied cognition. I was just gossiping about a few attempts in the field of language acquisition to incorporate the ideas of embodied cognition in the study of grammatical development. This was a study of the relationship between tense, past, present, future, and timing of the occurrence, whether it was aligned, whether the use of present tense was aligned with the activities of the mother and child. And they came with a very complicated set of results, finding somewhat weak evidence for it. The problem was they didn't control for the fact that different verbs have already strong associations with certain tenses, so that children could go through language without having to go to the timing of utterance. So, the jury's out on that one, but it's complicated. And the problem is, as I said, people that work a lot on the interaction side don't pay enough attention to language structure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I'd like to continue on with the theme of embodied cognition. So as a roboticist, we're obviously interested in embodiment. If a child is learning language in an embodied sense, they're pushing against the world and observing how the world pushes back.
Yes.
And you gave us some insight into how language differs across cultures and languages. Is there any work that looks at how embodied acquisition of language might differ across cultures and languages?
As I just said, there's only 2 papers that I know of that appropriate the embodied cognition and try to explore it experimentally. So never mind languages or cultures, we're talking an N of 2, okay? And I have problems with the way they slice the world, in a sense.
I see.
Okay. That said, I have a question for you. So a lot of what happens on language learning is from the face back. So before we say our first word, we've been comprehending for a year. What does embodied cognition has to say about that? So most of language learning is receptive.
So
what would you do about that?
Right, the question is how much, if at all, does embodiment play in early language acquisition? Okay. Yes, let's talk about that for sure.
Great. Look forward to it.
It's a good panel. early language learning being receptive as opposed to performative. But I'm wondering if you believe that it could still be embodied, just in terms of early babbling, imitation, expression sharing,
True.
and also turn-taking in early conversation.
True, true. I stand corrected. Thank you. I just taught that class 2 weeks ago. I should know better. I tend not to think in embodied cognition terms. Right.
Okay.
But you're right. Babies listen, but they also babble and practice what they've listened.
Yeah.
Right. So the same phonetic tuning that we see in babies, where their acoustic perception abilities are being honed, we see reflected in babbling as a babbling drift. So the babbling of a 5-month-old is very generic. The babbling of a 10-month-old is very language specific. So the same process.
May I ask what you mean by language specific in babbling?
It means that the consonants and the syllable structures of the child will clue you, or not you, not me, but my phonetician friends will know whether this is a German child or a Catalonian child.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah,
Does it
so to
also-
us it just sounds like babbling, right?
Yeah.
Ba, 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 ba. But a phonetician can tell that the babbling sounds different by the age of 10 months, not by the age of 4 or 5 or 6.
Okay. Is there also increasingly culturally or language-specific diction or tone, like intonation?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And we call it prosody.
Prosody.
Right.
Okay,
And
thank you.
prosody is one of the things that children recruit to map out the structure, to segment words out of the speech is continuous, right? We don't have words separators, except that they're very little small acoustic cues, and children use those to help segment, and they use sentence prosody to help structure phrases. It's a weak support, but it is nonetheless a support for the development of morphosyntax.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hi.
I enjoyed the talk very much and
Thank
took
you.
extensive notes, but I also want to push back a little on this
Okay.
Receptive aspect of early language learning. So not only are the babbling and all those components, but face-to-face play, which has contingent reactions by the child, invites a great deal. Much of breaking into early language is about linking words and word segments with the visual world, and one's
Yes.
baby starting at 4 months are holding objects and manipulating them, and people are talking about them.
Yes.
There is, again, this great contingency. You see this when you look at children with atypical components of development who have poor sensory motor skills, and
Yes.
how that impacts, just like bilingualism impacts these trajectories. Poor sensory motor skills in terms of holding and handling objects impacts
Yes.
breaking into language. And so, anyway, just a small pushback.
No, that's great. Again, you can see how I'm a syntactician and not a real developmentalist. I taught this stuff. I taught this stuff too. I taught this stuff 2 weeks ago, and I showed my students a study by Jung and Werker, where the kids learned the words. It was about it's something about sound learning, and it turns out that babies learn the sound contrast well if a human was in the room. They did not learn it from a TV, so there goes baby Einstein theories. And they didn't learn it at all from just a sound coming out of a speaker. Okay, so radio is bad, television is no better. You need your human caretaker to break into language. So yes, you're right, that completely undoes what I said. That said, I don't know, I'm a syntactician, right? So what I'm interested in is things like this antecedent contained deletion beast, where you have an invisible part of a sentence that we recover from context, and yet we project very, very specific structure, and children are so stable about these things, right? So this is about how does embodiment has to do with that. It's pure form.
Concessive note, please join me in thanking Ella